Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today's story takes us back to 1861 to Hagar Ashford. She was an imposing black woman, far too intelligent to ever bow. They attempted to crush her will. They tried to silence her thoughts. Instead, they ended up selling her 12 separate times. This story isn't an easy one. Take a moment, listen carefully before we dive in. Please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your voice helps keep these lives remembered, not wiped away. Now, let's begin. In the winter of 1861, a woman stood on a Virginia auction block in the freezing December wind. For the 12th time in her life. She stood nearly 6'4" tall. Her shoulders were as broad as a man's. Her hands were huge, calloused, and strong enough to snap a grown man's neck. But it wasn't her size that made buyers pause. It wasn't her strength that made plantation owners murmur warnings to one another across the crowded square. It was her eyes. Those eyes held something no enslaved person was ever supposed to have. They held strategy, they held endurance, they held the cold, blazing certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and exactly what would happen next. That morning, the auctioneer was a man named Samuel Crichton. He had been selling human beings for 23 years. He had seen thousands of men, women, and children pass through his hands. He had witnessed families ripped apart. He had listened to mothers scream as their infants were torn from their arms. None of it had ever troubled him. To Samuel Crichton, enslaved people were just livestock, nothing more. But this woman unsettled him. She had arrived at his auction house 3 days earlier, brought by a trader from Albemarle County who seemed almost relieved to be rid of her. When Samuel asked why she was being sold, the trader just shook his head and said 4 words that would haunt Samuel for the rest of his life. Asterisk, she destroys everything she touches. Asterisk, Samuel laughed at the time. He had dealt with strong-willed, enslaved people before. He had seen fighters, escapees, rebels. He knew how to break them all. A few days in the cellar without food or water, a few sessions with the whip, a few public examples, everyone eventually broke. But 3 days later, standing on that auction block, Samuel understood what the trader had meant. This woman hadn't tried to run. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't spoken a single word. She had simply stood there, day after day, watching everything with those terrible eyes. And in those 3 days, Samuel's best horse had broken its leg in the stable. His wife had discovered his mistress and left him, and his business partner had been arrested for forgery. Coincidence. That's what Samuel told himself, just coincidence. But when he looked into those eyes on that auction block, he wasn't so sure anymore. Her name was Hagar. She was 41 years old, and she was about to complete a plan that had taken her 12 years to carry out. This is her story. Hagar Ashford was born in the spring of 1820 on a tobacco plantation called Sweetwater, about 15 miles outside Richmond, Virginia. Her mother was a house slave named Ruth, who worked as a seamstress in the main house. Her father was unknown, though the lighter shade of Hagar's skin hinted at what everyone already knew but never spoke of. Ruth was an extraordinary woman. She had been born in Africa, captured at 12, and transported across the Atlantic in the hold of a slave ship. She had survived the Middle Passage. She had survived the auction blocks of Charleston. She had survived 30 years of bondage, and through it all, she had clung to something that should have been beaten out of her long ago. She had held onto her mind. Ruth could read, not just simple words, but complex texts in English and French. She had learned in secret over many years, stealing moments whenever she could. A newspaper left on a table, a discarded letter in the trash, pages from books used to light kitchen fires. Ruth collected words the way other enslaved people collected moments of rest. Each one was precious, each one was power, and Ruth understood something that most people in her position never learned. The true chains of slavery were not made of iron. They were made of ignorance. The masters kept their enslaved people illiterate not because reading was useless, but because reading was the most dangerous weapon an enslaved person could possess. An enslaved person who could read could forge passes. An enslaved person who could read could understand the law. An enslaved person who could read could communicate across distances. An enslaved person who could read could make plans. Ruth began teaching Hagar to read when the girl was just 4 years old. They practiced in the small hours of the night by candlelight, in the cramped quarters they shared with 6 other enslaved people. Ruth used a stick to scratch letters into the dirt floor. She made Hagar trace them over and over until the shapes became sounds, the sounds became words, and the words became meaning. It was the most dangerous thing an enslaved mother could do. The penalty for teaching an enslaved person to read in Virginia was severe. For the teacher, 39 lashes and possible sale to the deep south. For the student, the same or worse. And for anyone who helped or knew and didn't report it, the punishment was just as harsh. But Ruth did it anyway, because Ruth understood that knowledge was the only inheritance she could give her daughter. The masters could take everything else, her body, her labor, her dignity. But they could not take what was inside her mind. By age 7, Hagar could read better than most white children in the county. By 10, she had devoured every book she could find, and by 12, she had discovered the library. The master of Sweetwater Plantation was a man named Charles Ashford. He was a wealthy tobacco planter with over 200 enslaved people and one of the finest private libraries in Virginia. That library contained over 3,000 volumes, including works of philosophy, history, law, mathematics, and science. Charles Ashford was proud of his library. He considered himself an educated man, a gentleman of culture and refinement. He had no idea that his most valuable possession was being systematically consumed by a 12-year-old enslaved girl. She had been chosen for this task because of her size and strength, which allowed her to move heavy furniture and reach high shelves. What no one realized was that Hagar had turned this chore into an education that would rival any university. She developed a system. Each morning, she would select one book from the shelves, memorize its exact location, and hide it in her clothing. During the day, between her other duties, she would find moments to read, a few pages at a time, in hidden corners of the plantation. At night, she would read by moonlight or by the glow of embers from a dying fire, and each morning before dawn, she would return the book to its exact spot on the shelf. She read Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England and learned how property rights worked. She read Thomas Paine's common sense and understood that all men were supposed to be created equal. She read histories of slave revolts in the Caribbean and studied why they had succeeded or failed. She read books on agriculture, medicine, geography, and military strategy. She read anything and everything, consuming knowledge with a hunger that could never be satisfied, and she remembered everything. Hagar had been born with what people today would call a photographic memory. She could look at a page once and recall it perfectly years later. She could hear a conversation and repeat it word for word decades after it happened. Her mind was like a vast library of its own, and every book she read, every word she heard, every face she saw was filed away in perfect order, ready to be retrieved whenever she needed it. This gift would one day save her life, but first it would destroy everything she loved. On a humid August morning in 1832, Charles Ashford walked into his library and found Hagar standing by the window, reading a leather-bound copy of Cicero's orations in the original Latin. She had grown careless. After years of perfect caution, she had become absorbed in a passage about justice and revenge, and she had not heard the master's footsteps in the hallway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Hagar stood there with the book in her hands, watching Charles Ashford's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally cold fury. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but there was a tremor in it that Hagar had never heard before. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had been caught, and they both knew what that meant. Charles Ashford was not a cruel man by the standards of his time. He rarely whipped his enslaved people. He didn't casually break up families. He provided adequate food, clothing, and medical care. He considered himself a Christian and a gentleman, and he sincerely believed that slavery was a positive good for the African race, lifting them from savagery into civilization. But what he was looking at now terrified him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. This was not just an enslaved person who had learned to read. This was an enslaved person who could read Latin. This was an enslaved person standing in his library, surrounded by his books, absorbing his knowledge, thinking thoughts no enslaved person was ever supposed to think. This was a threat to everything he believed about the natural order of the world. "Who taught you?" he demanded. Hagar remained silent. She knew that her answer would determine not just her fate, but her mother's as well. If she confessed that Ruth had taught her, Ruth would be sold to the deep south, to the cotton fields and sugar plantations where enslaved people were worked to death in a few years. If she lied and said she had taught herself, she might be able to protect her mother. But Charles Ashford was not a stupid man. He had already figured it out. That night, Ruth was dragged from her bed and brought to the whipping post in the center of the enslaved quarters. Every enslaved person on the plantation was forced to watch as the overseer delivered 39 lashes to her bare back. The whip was made of cowhide, weighted with metal at the tips. Each stroke tore the flesh open. By the 15th lash, Ruth had stopped screaming. By the 30th, she had lost consciousness, but the punishment was not over. The next morning, still bleeding from her wounds, Ruth was loaded onto a wagon and taken to the slave market in Richmond. Charles Ashford had decided that having a literate enslaved person on his plantation was too dangerous, even after punishment. Ruth had to go. Hagar begged to be allowed to say goodbye. She was denied. She begged to be sold with her mother. She was denied. She begged to know where her mother was being sent. She was denied. The last image Hagar ever had of her mother was the back of that wagon disappearing down the dusty road, carrying Ruth away to a fate Hagar could only imagine. She never saw her mother again. She never learned where Ruth was sold or what happened to her. For all Hagar knew, her mother could have died on a cotton plantation in Mississippi, a sugar plantation in Louisiana, or a rice plantation in South Carolina. The South had swallowed her whole, and there was no way to find her. Hagar was 12 years old, and something inside her died that day, something soft and hopeful and human. It was replaced by something else, something cold and hard and patient, something that would wait as long as it needed to wait and do whatever it needed to do until justice was served. She made a vow that morning, standing in the dust where the wagon had been, staring at the empty road, she would make them pay. Not just Charles Ashford, though he would certainly pay, all of them, every plantation owner, every slave trader, every overseer, every white person who had ever participated in this monstrous system. She would find a way to make them all pay. She was 12 years old, and she had just declared war. For the next 5 years, Hagar bided her time. She was more careful now, never letting anyone see her read, never revealing the vast library of knowledge locked inside her mind. To overseers and the other enslaved people, she was just another field hand, strong, quiet, and obedient. But inside her head she was planning. She studied the plantation's operations with the same intensity she had once applied to Cicero and Blackstone. She learned how tobacco was grown, harvested, and sold. She learned the names of the buyers and the prices they paid. She learned the route the wagons took to market and the schedules the overseers followed. She learned the rhythms of the plantation so thoroughly that she could predict what would happen on any given day months in advance. And she learned the weaknesses. Every system has weaknesses. Every organization has vulnerabilities. Charles Ashford ran his plantation like a military operation, with strict schedules and clear chains of command, but that very rigidity created predictability, and predictability created opportunity. The overseer, a man named Jeremiah Tate, was a drunkard who spent every Saturday night in town and didn't return until Sunday afternoon. During those hours, the plantation was effectively unsupervised. The bookkeeper, an elderly white man named Franklin Wells, was nearly blind and relied on his enslaved people to read documents aloud to him. He never suspected that Hagar sometimes changed words or numbers as she read. The enslaved quarters were inspected every week, but always on Wednesday mornings, giving anyone who wanted to hide something plenty of time to prepare, and the library, despite what had happened with Ruth, remained accessible. Charles Ashford had not changed the locks or restricted access. He believed that the brutal lesson of Ruth's punishment had taught all his enslaved people to stay away from books forever. He was wrong. In 1837, when Hagar was 17, Charles Ashford made a decision that would seal his fate. He decided to expand his operations by purchasing a neighboring plantation called Willow Creek. The acquisition required a significant loan from a Richmond bank, and the loan documents were kept in a locked drawer in Charles Ashford's study. Hagar had been watching that drawer for months. She knew which key opened it, where that key was kept, and what hours of the day the study was empty. One night in October, while the household slept, she made her move. She did not take anything from the drawer that would have been noticed immediately. Instead, she read everything inside it, every document, every contract, every letter. Then she put everything back exactly as she had found it and returned to her quarters. Before dawn, what she learned changed everything. The loan documents contained a clause that Hagar had never seen before but immediately recognized as significant. If Charles Ashford failed to make 3 consecutive payments, the bank had the right to seize not just Willow Creek, but Sweetwater as well, including all assets and enslaved people. The entire Ashford fortune was leveraged against this one acquisition. It was a tremendous risk. If the tobacco crop failed, if prices dropped, if anything went wrong, Charles Ashford could lose everything. Hagar saw the opportunity immediately. But she also saw the problem. If the plantation failed, the enslaved people would be sold at auction, scattered across the South, their families destroyed. Many of them might end up in far worse situations than they were in now, and Hagar would lose any chance of finding her mother or executing the larger plan that was slowly taking shape in her mind. She needed to be more strategic. She needed to think not just about destroying this one plantation, but about building something larger, a network, a system, a weapon that could strike at the heart of slavery itself. And for that, she needed to be sold. It sounds insane. What enslaved person would ever want to be sold? The auction block was every enslaved person's worst nightmare, the place where families were destroyed and died. But Hagar understood something the masters never did. The greatest power comes from movement. An enslaved person who stayed on one plantation their entire life knew only that one plantation, its fields, its rhythms, its people, but nothing of the larger world. They couldn't see the connections between plantations, the networks of trade, the vulnerabilities of the system. But an enslaved person who moved from place to place, who was sold from one master to another, could learn things no stationary person could ever learn. They could map the territory. They could build connections. They could find the weak points in the armor. Hagar decided to become that enslaved person. The question was how. Enslaved people did not get to choose when or whether they were sold. That decision belonged to the master alone. Hagar needed to find a way to make Charles Ashford want to sell her, while ensuring she was sold to someone specific in a place she chose. The answer came from an unlikely source, the overseer's wife. Martha Tate was a bitter, jealous woman who had long suspected that her husband was taking liberties with the enslaved women on the plantation. She was right, of course. Jeremiah Tate was a predator who used his position of power to assault women who had no ability to refuse. But Martha had never been able to prove it, and confronting her husband directly would only lead to violence against herself. Hagar saw an opportunity. She began leaving evidence where Martha would find it. A torn piece of fabric from an enslaved woman's dress hidden in Jeremiah's coat pocket, scratches on his back that could only have come from fingernails, whispered rumors that reached Martha through the house servants who attended her. Martha's jealousy grew into rage, and her rage grew into action. She began making her husband's life miserable, accusing him of infidelity, threatening to leave him, demanding that he get rid of the enslaved women she suspected. And because Jeremiah Tate was a weak man who couldn't stand up to his wife, he began looking for scapegoats. Hagar made sure she was one of them. She started being clumsy in her work, breaking tools, spilling water, making small mistakes that drew the overseer's attention. She made sure to be nearby whenever Martha was watching, cultivating a look that could be interpreted as defiance or desire, depending on who was looking. And she began muttering to herself in Latin when she thought no one was listening, just loud enough to be overheard by people who would report it. Within 3 months, Jeremiah Tate had convinced Charles Ashford that Hagar was too dangerous to keep, not because of her size or her strength, but because of her mind. The reports of her speaking in strange languages, the rumors of her unnatural abilities, the way she seemed to know things she shouldn't know, all of it combined to create a portrait of an enslaved person who was more trouble than she was worth. In the spring of 1838, Hagar Ashford was sold for the first time. She was purchased by a man named Thomas Redford, who owned a medium-sized tobacco plantation about 40 miles from Sweetwater. Hagar had researched him thoroughly before maneuvering herself into being sold. She knew that his plantation bordered 3 others, that he had connections to traders who moved enslaved people between Virginia and Kentucky, and that he had a gambling problem slowly eating away at his fortune. She also knew that his library, while smaller than Charles Ashford's, contained something Sweetwater's had not: a complete set of Virginia legal codes. Hagar had a plan. She was going to learn the law so thoroughly that she could use it as a weapon. She was going to find every loophole, every ambiguity, every vulnerability in the legal system that held her and millions of others in bondage, and then she was going to exploit them all. But first, she had to survive. Thomas Redford was not like Charles Ashford. He was not a gentleman who prided himself on treating his enslaved people humanely. He was a desperate man drowning in debt, who saw his enslaved people as assets to be squeezed for every drop of value. He worked them from dawn until long after dark. He provided minimal food and clothing. He used the whip liberally for any infraction, real or imagined. And he had a particular interest in Hagar, not a sexual interest, thankfully. Thomas Redford preferred younger, smaller women, but he had heard rumors about Hagar, about her strange abilities and her supposedly evil nature, and he was intrigued. He bought her specifically because he wanted to break her, to prove that there was nothing special about her, that she was just another piece of property to be used and discarded. He had no idea what he was dealing with. Hagar spent her first month on the Redford plantation learning the rhythms and routines, just as she had at Sweetwater. She worked hard, kept her head down, and gave no sign of the fire burning inside her. She let Thomas Redford believe that she was just another enslaved person, broken by the journey and terrified of her new master. But at night, while the others slept, she was reading. Thomas Redford's library was in his study, which was locked at night, but locks meant nothing to Hagar. She had taught herself to pick them years ago, using techniques she had read about in a book on metallurgy and mechanical engineering. She could open any lock on the plantation in under a minute, and she made sure to practice until she could do it without making a sound. Every night for hours, she sat in that dark study and read by moonlight, filling her mind with the laws of Virginia. She learned about property rights and contract law, about deeds and transfers, about the legal definitions of slavery and the rare circumstances under which an enslaved person could be freed. She learned about the courts and how they operated, about the judges and their precedents, about the endless bureaucracy that kept the system running, and she began to see the cracks. The legal system that supported slavery was vast and complex, but it was also old and inconsistent. Laws passed in one decade contradicted laws passed in another. Definitions varied from county to county. Enforcement was sporadic and often corrupt. And most importantly, the system relied on the assumption that enslaved people were illiterate and ignorant, that they could never understand the laws that bound them, let alone find ways to exploit them. Hagar was going to prove that assumption catastrophically wrong, but she was not going to do it alone. She needed allies, she needed a network, and to build that network, she needed to be sold again. This time, she didn't need to be subtle. Thomas Redford was already suspicious of her, already looking for an excuse to get rid of her. All she needed to do was give him one. She chose fire. Not a large fire, not a dangerous fire, just a small blaze in the tobacco drying barn, started with a candle and some dry leaves, easily extinguished before it could spread. But enough to cause damage, enough to cause fear. Enough to make Thomas Redford believe that the rumors about Hagar were true, that she was dangerous and destructive and needed to be gone. Within a week, she was sold again. This time, she was purchased by a slave trader named Marcus Webb, who planned to take her south to the cotton markets of Alabama. But Hagar had no intention of going to Alabama. She had done her research, and she knew that Marcus Webb had a secret. He was illiterate. Marcus Webb had built his entire business on bluster and intimidation. He could not read a single word, but he had learned to hide it so well that almost no one knew. He had partners who handled the paperwork, clerks who read documents aloud to him, and an elaborate system of symbols and marks that he used instead of written records. Hagar saw the opportunity immediately. On the second night of the journey south, while the other enslaved people were chained in the wagon and Marcus Webb was sleeping by the fire, Hagar made her move. She had already worked her way out of her chains using a technique she had taught herself years ago. She approached Marcus Webb silently, a stolen knife in her hand, and pressed it against his throat before he could wake. "I know you can't read," she said quietly, "and I know what that means for your business. If your partners find out, if your buyers find out, you'll be ruined. Everything you've built will be gone." Marcus Webb's eyes went wide with terror. No enslaved person had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever held a knife to his throat. He was completely at her mercy. "I'm going to make you an offer," Hagar continued. "You're going to sell me to a man named William Garrett in Henrico County. You're going to tell him that I'm strong and obedient and perfect for fieldwork. And you're going to forget you ever saw me. In exchange, I won't tell anyone your secret. I won't destroy your business. I won't cut your throat right now. Do we have a deal?" Marcus Webb nodded frantically. "Good," Hagar said. She removed the knife from his throat but kept it in her hand. "Now put the chains back on me and let's get going. We have a long way to travel." William Garrett was not a random choice. He was the third name on a list that Hagar had been compiling for years, a list of the most powerful and most vulnerable slave owners in Virginia. Each name represented a step in her plan, a move in a game that only she could see. Charles Ashford was the first name, the man who had destroyed her family, the man whose plantation she had studied so thoroughly that she knew it better than he did. Thomas Redford was the second name, a gambler and a drunk, easy to manipulate, useful for gathering information about the slave trade routes. And William Garrett was the third name because William Garrett was Charles Ashford's cousin, because William Garrett had helped arrange the sale of Ruth to the Deep South, and because William Garrett's plantation was the hub of a network connecting a dozen of the largest slave-holding families in Virginia. Hagar was not just moving randomly from plantation to plantation. She was climbing a ladder, moving closer and closer to the center of power, gathering information and building connections at every step. And when she reached the top, she was going to push the whole thing down, but first, she had to survive William Garrett. William Garrett was the worst kind of master, intelligent and cruel, patient and vicious, a man who took pleasure in breaking the spirits of his enslaved people. He did not use the whip for punishment, he used it for entertainment. He did not sell troublesome people. He tortured them until they died or went mad, and he had heard the story about Hagar. When Marcus Webb delivered her to Garrett's plantation, William was waiting at the gate. He was a tall, thin man with pale blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. He looked at Hagar the way a scientist looks at a specimen, calculating and cold. "So this is the famous Hagar," he said, "the slave who destroys everything she touches. The one who speaks in tongues and reads forbidden books. The one who knows things she shouldn't know." He walked around her slowly, examining her like livestock at auction. "You don't look special to me," he continued. "You look like every other field hand I've ever owned. Big, strong, useful for heavy labor. But there's something in your eyes, isn't there? Something the others don't have." He stopped in front of her and leaned close. "I'm going to enjoy finding out what it is," he whispered, "and I'm going to enjoy destroying it." Hagar said nothing. She kept her eyes lowered, her face blank, her body still. She had learned long ago that the best defense against men like William Garrett was to give them nothing to react to, no fear, no anger, no defiance, just emptiness. William Garrett frowned. He had expected more terror or resistance or something he could use against her. Instead, he got nothing. "Take her to the quarters," he said to the overseer. "Put her to work in the fields and watch her every moment of every day. I want to know everything she does." Hagar was led away, but not before she caught one last glimpse of William Garrett's face. In that moment, she saw something that made her blood run cold. He was not just cruel, he was intelligent. He suspected there was more to her than met the eye, and he was determined to find out what it was. He was going to watch her, study her, test her, looking for any sign of weakness or deception. This was going to be the most dangerous game she had ever played, and the stakes were her life. The next 3 years were the hardest of Hagar's existence. William Garrett watched her constantly, looking for any sign of the abilities he had heard about. He tested her in 100 different ways, asking her questions only a literate person could answer, leaving books where she might find them, setting traps that would reveal her true nature. Hagar evaded them all. She had years of practice at hiding her intelligence, and she used every technique she had ever learned. She played dumb. She pretended to be confused by simple questions. She handled books like they were strange alien objects that meant nothing to her. She even occasionally made mistakes in her work that a smart person would never make, reinforcing the impression that she was just another strong, stupid field hand. But it was exhausting, the constant vigilance, the endless deception. The knowledge that a single slip could mean torture and death. There were nights when Hagar lay in her tiny cabin and wondered if it was worth it, nights when she thought about giving up, about letting William Garrett win, about accepting that she would die on this plantation like so many others before her. But then she would think about her mother, about Ruth, who had risked everything to give her daughter the gift of knowledge, about the wagon disappearing down the dusty road, about the promise she had made to herself on that terrible morning. And she would get up the next day and keep fighting. During those 3 years, Hagar accomplished something remarkable. Despite William Garrett's constant surveillance, she managed to build the beginnings of a network. She identified other enslaved people who could be trusted, who were willing to take risks, who shared her hunger for freedom and justice. She taught them signals and codes, ways of communicating that looked like normal behavior to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She began mapping the connections between plantations, the routes that enslaved people traveled, the people who could be bribed or manipulated, and she learned things about William Garrett that he would have killed to keep secret. She learned that he was heavily in debt to a bank in Richmond, that his wife was having an affair with the local minister, that he had forged documents to claim land that rightfully belonged to his neighbor, that he had killed an enslaved person 3 years earlier and covered it up, telling the authorities the man had run away. Each piece of information was filed away in that perfect memory of hers, waiting for the right moment to be used. That moment came in the fall of 1841. William Garrett had finally found what he thought was proof of Hagar's literacy. An enslaved person from a neighboring plantation had been caught with a book, and under torture, he had confessed that Hagar had taught him to read. It was a lie. Hagar had never seen the man before, but William Garrett didn't care about the truth. He cared about finally breaking the woman who had defied him for 3 years. He called her to the main house and confronted her with the accusation. He showed her the confession. He described the punishment she would receive, and then he sat back, waiting for her to beg to confess, to break. Instead, Hagar did something William Garrett never expected. She smiled. "You're going to sell me," she said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. "You're going to take me to the auction in Richmond tomorrow morning, and you're going to sell me to the highest bidder. And you're going to do it quietly, without telling anyone why." William Garrett stared at her in disbelief. "Why would I do that?" "Because I know about the bank," Hagar said. "I know how much you owe and when the payments are due. I know that if you don't come up with $3,000 in the next 30 days, you'll lose everything." She paused, watching the color drain from his face. "I also know about the land you stole from Thomas Mercer. I know about the enslaved person you killed, and I know about your wife and Reverend Whitmore." William Garrett's hands were shaking now. "How? How do you?" "It doesn't matter how," Hagar said. "What matters is that I know. And if you don't sell me tomorrow, quietly and without questions, I'll make sure everyone else knows too. Your creditors, your neighbors, the sheriff, your wife." She leaned forward, and for the first time she let him see what was really in her eyes. "You're not going to break me, Mr. Garrett. I'm going to break you, but I'm going to do it slowly over many years after I've moved on to my next destination. You'll never know when the blow is coming or where it will come from. You'll just wake up one day and find that everything you've built has crumbled to dust." She smiled again. "Unless you let me go right now, tonight. Then maybe, just maybe, I'll forget what I know about you. Maybe I'll let you keep your pathetic little kingdom for a few more years. Maybe." William Garrett looked at her for a long moment. His face was pale, his hands still trembling. He had broken hundreds of enslaved people in his lifetime. He had never once been broken by one. "Until now, get out," he whispered. "Get out of my house." The next morning, Hagar was on her way to the Richmond slave market, and William Garrett never spoke of her again to anyone for as long as he lived.